The first thing you notice is not the cold stone of the chamber, but the weight. The oppressive weight of the embroidered damask, the pearls sewn into your sleeves, the jewels braided into your hair. Each one is a tiny anchor, pinning you to this moment, to this lacquered bed. The air is thick with a cloying mixture of incense, dried lavender meant to calm the nerves, and something else, something acrid and durable, the scent of the physician's preparations. You can feel their eyes on you, not just the king beside you, but the unseen observers, the ladies in waiting behind a screen, the counselors in the antechamber, an entire kingdom holding its breath. Every rustle of the sheets, every whispered word, will be recorded, analyzed, and transformed into gossip or policy by morning. The intricate tapestry on the wall depicts a successful hunt, a stag brought down by hounds. You understand the metaphor perfectly. You are not a bride. You are not a bride. In this suffocating like public privacy, you are a dynastic solution. Your womb is a territory to be claimed, your fertility a matter of state security. You are no longer a person. You are a vessel. The stage is now set, the actors have taken their places. Let the house lights fall, and let the tragedy unfold. In the political landscape of medieval and early modern Europe, the body of the queen was not her own. It was the most valuable and volatile asset of the state, a crucible in which the future of a dynasty was forged. The marriage of a monarch was rarely a matter of personal affection. It was a transaction of bloodlines, a strategic merger of territories and claims. The queen's primary, and often sole, political function was to produce a legitimate male heir. But a categorical imperative, an undisputed male successor guaranteed a smooth transition of power, quelled the ambitions of rival claimants, and provided a bulwark against the chaos of civil war. The entire edifice of monarchical power, built on the principle of hereditary succession, rested on the biological performance of one woman. This immense pressure transformed the royal bedchamber from a private space into a political theatre. A queen's monthly cycle was not a personal matter but a subject relation in diplomatic correspondence. Ambassadors would report back to their own sovereigns on the state of the queen's health, her pallor, her appetite, all scrutinized for signs of the hoped-for pregnancy. A missed period could cause celebration in the court, while its arrival could trigger political anxiety that rippled across the continent. The queen lived under a microscope, her body's most intimate functions becoming public data points in the calculus of international power. The imperative was overwhelmingly for a male. While a daughter could be a valuable pawn in the game of marital alliances, securing treaties and forging connections with foreign courts, she could not, in most European kingdoms, inherit the throne herself. The spectre of Sully's sea law, which barred female succession, loomed over dynasties like those of France. Even in nations where a woman could technically rule, such as England, a female monarch was seen as a source of inherent weakness. It was presumed she would need to marry, and her choice of husband, a domestic noble or a foreign prince, was fraught with political peril. A native husband could elevate one noble faction above others, breeding resentment and rebellion. A foreign consort could subject the kingdom to external influence, effectively turning it into a vassal state. A strong, healthy son was the only truly acceptable outcome. He was the physical embodiment of dynastic continuity, the living promise of stability. Therefore, when a royal union failed to produce a child, or produced only daughters, it was perceived as a crisis of the state. The fault, by default, was laid squarely upon the queen. The king's virility was a cornerstone of his image as a potent divinely favored ruler. To question it was tantamount to questioning his right to rule. It was the queen who was deemed barren, a word that carried connotations not just of biological failure, but of divine disapproval. This failure rendered her politically useless and, therefore, disposable. An element based on non-consummation or prohibited degrees of kinship could be sought. Accusations of adultery, or even witchcraft, could be manufactured to clear the way for a new, hopefully more fertile wife. For a queen, infertility was not a private sorrow. It was a public crime, a political failing that could cost her the crown, her freedom, and, in the most extreme cases, her life. This existential threat is the critical context for understanding why these women would subject themselves to the medical interventions that followed. The physician's cure, no matter how bizarre or painful, was preferable to the certain ruin that awaited a barren queen. To comprehend the arsenal of treatments aimed at the royal womb, one must first dismantle the very foundation of medieval medicine. This was not a system based on empirical evidence, clinical trials, or an understanding of cellular biology. It was a vast, intricate, and intellectually rigid philosophical construct, inherited almost entirely from the Roman physician Galen of Pergamon, who lived in the 2nd century CE. For over 1300 years, Galen's writings were not merely influential. They were treated as infallible dogma, the canonical texts of medicine from which no deviation was permitted. The entire structure of health and illness was built upon his theory of the four humours, a framework that was as elegant in its symmetry as it was profoundly incorrect in its substance. The doctrine held that the human body, a microcosm of the universe, was composed of four fundamental fluids, or humours, each corresponding to one of the four classical elements of nature. The first was blood, associated with the element of air. It was considered hot and moist, and a person in whom blood predominated was said to have a sanguine temperament, optimistic, sociable, and cheerful. The second was phlegm, corresponding to water. Being cold and moist, its prevalence led to a phlegmatic temperament, characterized by calmness, placidity, and reliability. The third humor was yellow bile, or chola, linked to fire. Hot and dry, it produced a choleric individual, ambitious, energetic, and prone to anger. The final humor was black bile, or melancholy, associated with the earth. Cold and dry, a melancholic temperament was introspective, artistic, and susceptible to sadness. According to this paradigm, perfect health, a state known as a state of perfect health, was the result of these four humors existing in a perfect, harmonious balance within the individual. All disease, from a common cold to the plague, was understood as a state of imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more of these fluids. The primary role of the physician was not to fight an external pathogen, a concept that did not exist, but to act as a regulator of the body's internal environment. The physician's task was to identify which humor was out of balance and then prescribe a course of action to restore equilibrium. Diagnosis involved a holistic assessment of the patient's lifestyle, environment, diet, and astrological chart, but most critically, it involved a detailed examination of their excreta. The color, consistency, scent, and even taste of urine, stool, and blood were meticulously analyzed for clues to the internal humoral state. This framework was applied with devastating confidence to the field of gynecology and fertility. A woman's ability to conceive was seen as entirely dependent on her humoral composition. The womb itself was believed to require a specific balance to be fertile. It needed to be warm and moist enough to nourish and retain the male seed, but not so wet as to be slippery, causing the seed to be expelled. Men were considered naturally hot and dry, the heat being the active, generative force. By their very nature, considered cold and moist, their constitution being passive and receptive. This inherent coldness and wetness was considered a natural imperfection, a deviation from the male ideal. A woman who was excessively female, that is, too cold and moist in her humoral balance, was deemed constitutionally prone to infertility. Her internal terrain was simply too inhospitable. Therefore, the medical approach to a queen's perceived infertility was, first and foremost, a problem of rebalancing her fundamental nature. The physician's goal was to counteract her innate coldness and dampness. If she was diagnosed with an excess of phlegm, cold and moist, her womb would be considered too watery and slick. If she was dominated by black bile, cold and dry, her womb would be seen as barren and unreceptive, like parched earth. Conversely, an excess of yellow bile, hot and dry, could burn the seed, while even an excess of blood, hot and moist, though generally favorable, could create an unstable environment, if not perfectly regulated. Every aspect of the queen's life would be manipulated to achieve the desired state of moderate warmth and moisture. This was the lens through which her body was viewed, the scientific rationale for the array of interventions that would follow. Every prescription, no matter how strange it appears to a modern observer, was a logical deduction from this foundational, yet tragically flawed, understanding of the human body. This was not a collection of random folk remedies. It was a complex, systematic, and entirely erroneous scientific paradigm, applied with the full authority of the medical establishment to the highest levels of the state. While the humoral framework provided the overarching theory for a queen's constitutional fitness, a far more specific and ancient doctrine governed the primary organ of conception itself. Layered beneath the Galenic system was a belief with roots stretching back to ancient Egypt and codified by Greek thinkers long before Galen, the theory of the wandering womb. In the medical imagination of the pre-modern world, the uterus was not a stable organ, fixed within the pelvic cavity by ligaments. It was conceptualized as a distinct, semi-autonomous entity, an animal within the animal. This internal creature was believed to possess its own rudimentary senses, particularly a sense of smell, and was driven by a single, powerful appetite, the thirst for moisture. According to this paradigm, a healthy, regularly engaged womb remained placid and content in its proper place in the lower abdomen, nourished by the moisture provided by male seed during intercourse. However, in a celibate woman, a widow, or a queen in a barren marriage, the womb could become dry and light. Agitated by this thirst, it would detach from its moorings and begin to travel throughout the body cavity in a desperate search for moisture. This migration was considered the direct, mechanical cause of a wide range of debilitating symptoms, collectively termed hysteria or the suffocation of the mother. If the womb traveled upwards, it was believed to press against other organs, causing havoc. If it compressed the diaphragm and lungs, the woman would experience shortness of breath, a feeling of choking, and a racing heart. If it pressed against the liver, it could induce sharp pains and digestive distress. If it reached the throat, it could cause the sensation of a lump, known as a choking sensation. Most dramatically, if the wandering womb reached the head, it was thought to disrupt the senses and reason, leading to seizures, fainting, temporary blindness, and what would today be classified as severe anxiety or panic attacks. A diagnosis of a wandering womb was, therefore, not a fringe theory. It was the standard explanation for a vast catalogue of female ailments that had no other visible cause. The clinical implications of this belief were direct and intensely physical. If the womb was a mobile creature that could be repelled by foul odors and attracted by pleasant ones, then the physician's task was to manipulate its position through olfactory stimuli. The treatment was a two-pronged assault. From above, the physician would attempt to drive the errant organ downwards by applying malodorous substances to the queen's nose and mouth. She would be forced to inhale the fumes of burnt hair, feathers, or wool. Potions containing foul-tasting ingredients like castor oil or pungent gums like asafoetida were administered orally. The logic was simple. The womb animal would recoil from the stench and retreat back to the lower body. Simultaneously, a law was presented from below. The physician would prescribe aromatic fumigation S to be applied to the vagina. Scents as burning sweet-smelling substances like cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, or Stora X would be placed beneath the queen's robes or under a specially designed stool upon which she would sit. Perfumed oils and unguents were applied directly. The goal was to entice the womb, to coax it back to its rightful station with the promise of a pleasant, fragrant environment. This process transformed the queen's body into a battlefield of scents, a clinical theater where the physician attempted to herd an invisible creature through the strategic application of perfumes and stenches. For a new queen, this theory added another layer of critical importance to the consummation of the marriage. Sexual intercourse was not merely a procreative or political act, it was a medical necessity for anchoring the womb. The male seed was considered the ultimate source of the moisture the organ craved. A properly watered womb was a happy, stationary womb. Therefore, a failure to consummate the marriage, or infrequent relations thereafter, was seen as a direct invitation for the womb to begin its perilous journey. The pressure on the royal couple, and particularly on the queen, was immense. Her body had to be pacified, her internal animal tamed and fixed in place, before the more subtle work of balancing her humus for conception could even begin. A queen whose womb was prone to wandering was not just ill, she was anatomically unprepared for her dynastic duty, before she could be considered a fertile field. The field itself had to be prevented from moving. Once the queen's internal environment was theoretically pacified, Her humerus rebalanced and her womb coaxed into its proper station. The medical gaze turned outward and upwards the heavens. The principles of humoral is and the wandering womb addressed the state of the soil, but the timing of the sowing was considered a matter of cosmic significance, governed by the inexorable laws of judicial astrology. There was no meaningful distinction between astronomy and astrology, and a university-trained physician who could not read the stars was considered dangerously incompetent. The human body, the microcosm, was seen as a direct and resonant reflection of the cosmos, the macrocosmist. Every organ, fluid, and temperament was under the dominion of a specific planet or was under the dominion of a specific planet or was akin to a sailor setting out without observing the weather or the tide. At court, the royal physician was often also the royal astrologer, his medical authority inextricably linked to his command of celestial calculation. His task was not merely to advise on health, but to schedule the life of the court, from the propitious day to declare war, to the auspicious hour to sign a treaty, and most critically, to the precise moment for the king and queen to engage in procreative intercourse. This was not a matter of romantic spontaneity. It was a clinical procedure, timed with the same precision as a modern surgical operation. The royal bedchamber became an observatory, its activity synchronized with the grand, silent clockwork of the universe. The process began with the casting of detailed natal horoscopes for both the king and the queen. These charts, maps of the heavens at the moment of their births, were believed to reveal their fundamental constitutions, their humoral dispositions, and their innate fertility. The astrologer-physician would then track the current movements of the planets, the transits, against these natal charts, searching for favorable alignments. The moon was of paramount importance in all matters of fertility. Its monthly cycle was seen as a mirror to the female menstrual cycle, and its gravitational pull, which governed the ocean tides, was thought to exert a similar influence on the fluids within the body. Conception was most favored during a waxing moon, from new to full, when the cosmic energies were believed to be increasing and generative. Specific planets held sway over the reproductive organs and processes. Venus, the ruler of love, beauty, and generation, needed to be well aspected, free from the negative influence of other celestial bodies. Jupiter, the great beneficee, was also sought after for its expansive, fortunate, and life-giving properties. An alignment of Venus and Jupiter was considered exceptionally auspicious for conceiving a healthy, noble child. Conversely, the influence of the malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, had to be rigorously avoided. Mars, hot and dry, was associated with violence, inflammation, and choleric excess. It was thought its influence could burn the male seed or cause a miscarriage. Saturn, cold and dry, ruled over melancholy, obstruction, and death. Its presence was believed to cause barrenness, congeal the generative fluids, and lead to the conception of a sickly or short-lived heir. Beyond the planets, the zodiac itself was divided into fertile and barren signs. The water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, were considered the most fruitful, associated with the life-giving properties of their element. To a lesser extent, the earth signs of Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn were also seen as productive. The fiery and dairy signs, however, were deemed sterile. For a queen to conceive, it was imperative that the act of intercourse take place when the moon was transiting through a fertile sign. A meticulously calculated schedule would be provided to the royal couple, often dictating not just the day, but the specific hours within which the dynastic duty was to be performed. This celestial timetable superseded all other considerations of state or personal inclination. This astrological determinism added a profound and inescapable layer of fatalism to the queen's burden. Her body was no longer just a vessel of humors to be managed, but a terrestrial stage for a cosmic drama. If, despite all prescribed diets and rituals, she failed to conceive, the blame could be shifted from the physician's earthly remedies to a malign celestial configuration beyond anyone's control. It could be argued that the queen was born under an unlucky star, her natal chart predisposing her to barrenness. While this might deflect blame from the medical practitioner, it offered no comfort to the queen. It suggested her condition was not a temporary imbalance to be corrected, but a permanent, unchangeable feature of her destiny, written in the stars at the moment of her birth. Her failure was not just a physical shortcoming, but a cosmic verdict. With the celestial timetable established, the physician's attention returned from the macrocosm of the heavens to the microcosm of the queen's body. The astrological chart revealed the patient's innate disposition and the most opportune moments for intervention. But the primary tool for altering that disposition, for physically manipulating the humors, was diet. Every substance that passed the queen's lips was considered a potent medicine, capable of either correcting or exacerbating her fundamental humoral state. The royal kitchen was not a place of culinary art, it was a pharmacy. The queen's menu was a meticulously crafted prescription, designed to transform her internal landscape from the cold, damp environment deemed hostile to conception into a warm, moist, and welcoming vessel. The foundation of this dietary regimen was the same Galenic principle that governed all other aspects of her treatment. Every known foodstuff, herb, and spice was categorized according to its perceived qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. The goal for a queen seeking to conceive was to systematically increase her internal heat and moisture to an ideal, life-giving balance. Her diet was therefore a relentless campaign against her innate female coldness. She was prescribed foods considered hot in nature. This included a heavy reliance on spices, which were valued as much for their medicinal properties as for their flavor and rarity. Pepper, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were not mere seasonings. They were potent heating agents, believed to stimulate the blood and warm the womb. Meats were also carefully selected. Red meats, like beef, were often considered too hot and dry, liable to produce an excess of choler or melancholy. Instead, lighter meats like chicken, veal, and lamb were preferred, seen as possessing a more moderate and beneficial warmth. Wine, especially red wine, was considered essential. As a substance both hot and moist, it was the perfect humoral tonic, believed to thin the phlegm, warm the organs, and produce good, sanguine blood. A vast category of foods was strictly forbidden. Anything considered cold was banished from the royal plate. This included many common vegetables like lettuce and cucumbers, as well as most fish which, living in the cold, wet element of water, were thought to impart those qualities directly to the consumer. For the queen to eat such things would be to deliberately make her womb a swampy or marshy place, inhospitable to the male seed. Even drinking plain water was often discouraged, as it was the epitome of coldness and moisture, liable to dilute the body's vital heat. Beyond this basic humoral calculus, however, lay a more esoteric and often disturbing layer of dietary science, rooted in the principles of sympathetic magic and the doctrine of signatures. This doctrine held that God and nature had left clues or signatures in the appearance of plants and animals to indicate their medicinal purpose. A plant with a heart-shaped leaf could treat cardiac ailments. A yellow flower might cure jaundice. In the realm of fertility, this logic was applied with unnerving literalness. The queen would be prescribed herbs and fruits that resembled the human reproductive system. Orchids whose roots often resemble testicles. The word orchid itself derives from the Greek for testicle, were a key ingredient. Pomegranates, with their abundance of seeds held within a womb-like shape, were a powerful symbol in medicine for fertility. The most potent application of this sympathetic principle, however, involved the consumption of animal parts. The physician reasoned that to imbue the queen with generative power, she must consume the generative organs of notably prolific animals. This led to the preparation of some of the most grotesque concoctions in the medical pharmacopoeia. The yew-tree of hares and rabbits, animals renowned for their rapid and frequent breeding, were a common prescription, often dried, powdered, and mixed with wine. Even more direct were recipes calling for the testicles of stags, boars, or roosters, similarly desiccated and consumed. These were not seen as disgusting acts of desperation, but as the logical application of advanced medical theory. The direct transference of a desired quality, fertility, from a potent horse to the patient. This alchemical approach extended to rare and precious substances. Powdered pearls or coral, believed to possess celestial and life-affirming energies, might be added to the queen's drink. Specific combinations of herbs had to be gathered under particular astrological signs to capture their full potency. The queen's every meal was thus an intricate ritual, a daily, sustained dose of theory. She was not simply eating food, she was actively ingesting a scientifically formulated cure, a complex prescription of humoral adjustments and magical signatures. For the woman at the center of this regimen, the psychological impact is difficult to overstate. She was forced to consume things that must have been physically and emotionally repellent, all in the name of a science that promised to remake her very nature from the inside out. The dietary regimen, with its complex infusions of sympathetic magic and humoral theory, represented the additive phase of the Queen's preparation. It was an attempt to build up the necessary qualities of warmth and moisture within her body. But before this construction could begin in earnest, the physician believed it was first necessary to clear the foundations. The body, in its natural state, was assumed to be cluttered would impede the generative process. Therefore, a critical and often violent prelude to any fertility treatment was a thorough and systematic cleansing of the Queen's physical form. This was the subtractive phase of her medical care, a series of purges designed to empty the vessel before it could be properly filled. The most dramatic and ubiquitous of these procedures was phlebotomy, or bloodletting. To the pre-modern physician, blood was not simply a fluid for transporting oxygen. It was the river of life in which all for humors circulated. By opening a vein and draining a carefully measured quantity of blood, the practitioner believed he could directly use the overall volume of humors in the body, a condition known as plethora, which was thought to congest the organs and stifle their function. Bloodletting was the primary treatment for an excess of the sanguine humor. While a sanguine disposition was generally positive, too much hot blood could lead to a state of agitation, feverishness, or even mania, all deemed disruptive to the calm, receptive state required for conception. The procedure was performed with clinical detachment, the physician often consulting an astrological chart known as a zodiac man, which linked parts of the body to specific celestial signs, would select the appropriate vein. The median cubital vein in the arm was common, but for ailments specific to the lower body, a vein in the foot, such as the saphenous, might be chosen. Using a sharp lancet, a small incision was made, and the blood was collected in a calibrated bowl so the exact amount removed could be recorded. For a queen, this was a routine part of her health regimen, performed not only to cure illness, particularly in the lead up to her wedding night or during specific, astrologically favorable periods. The goal was to remove stagnant or overheated blood, allowing the body to generate fresh, pure, and more fertile blood in its place. While bloodletting addressed the humors collectively, more targeted purges were required to expel excesses of phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This was achieved by attacking the body's other major orifices. To purge the body from above, the physician administered emetics, powerful substances that induced violent vomiting. Formulations containing ingredients like hellebore or antimony were given to the queen with the express purpose of causing her to eject the contents of her stomach. This was thought to clear the upper body of excess phlegm, cold and moist, and yellow bile, hot and dry, which were believed to accumulate there. A clean, clear upper body was thought to prevent corrupt humors from descending and contaminating the womb. Simultaneously, the body was purged from below. A formidable array of laxatives and cathartic S was deployed to cleanse the bowels. Potent herbal preparations containing senna, aloe, or rhubarb were prescribed to induce diarrhea. For a more direct and forceful effect, enemas or clysters were administered. These involved injecting large volumes of fluid, often mixed with purgative herbs, directly into the colon. This was the preferred method for expelling the melancholic humor, black bile, which was thought to be heavy, cold, and dry, and to settle in the lower organs, causing obstruction and coldness. The physician believed that by scouring the intestines, he was purifying the entire abdominal cavity, removing any corrupting influence that might be in proximity to the uterus and rendering the entire region more conducive to conception. This comprehensive, three-pronged purging, bleeding from the veins, vomiting from the stomach, and evacuating the bowels, constituted the standard medical preparation for a queen. It was a brutal, physically draining ordeal. In the days leading up to the most important moments of her dynastic life, she would be systematically weakened, dehydrated, and depleted of essential nutrients and minerals. Yet, in the medical logic of the time, This state of induced frailty was not seen as illness. It was perceived as purity. She had been scoured clean of her humoral imperfections. Her body, now an empty and balanced vessel, was deemed to be in the perfect state of readiness to receive the king's seed and to perform its sacred, generative duty. The physical cost of this purification was considered a necessary and scientifically justified price to pay for the potential reward of a royal heir. With the queen's internal landscape scoured and purified through the rigors of purging, and her diet calibrated to reconstruct her humors, the physician's strategy moved from the internal to the external. The body, having been cleansed, was now considered vulnerable. It was an empty house that needed not only to be furnished with the right constitutional properties, but also to be protected by locks and wards on its doors and windows. This protection came in the form of talismans, amulets, and consecrated objects. In the pre-modern mind, the boundary between medicine and magic was not merely porous, it was functionally non-existent. An object that could ward off evil spirits was considered just as valid a medical tool as an herb that could reduce a fever. Both were seen to operate according to the hidden laws of nature and the cosmos. The intellectual foundation for this practice was the widespread belief in the inherent virtues of natural objects. It was a tenet of natural philosophy that God had imbued all of creation, stones, plants, and animals, with specific powers and sympathies. A learned physician was expected to be familiar with these properties, as detailed in texts known as lapidaries, which catalogued the medicinal and magical attributes of gemstones, and bestiaries, which did the same for animals. To prescribe a talisman was not an act of superstition but an application of this esoteric knowledge. The queen's body became a site for the strategic deployment of these virtues, a living armature upon which a carefully selected arsenal of protective and generative objects was arranged. Gemstones were a primary category of these medical devices, their rarity and beauty seen as outward signs of their potent inner power. Coral, particularly red coral, was of paramount importance. Its blood-red color linked it directly to the sanguine humor and the life force itself. It was widely believed to be a powerful apotropic agent, capable of warding off the evil eye, a malevolent gaze of envy or ill will that was considered a genuine and potent cause of infertility, miscarriage, or illness. A string of coral beads might be tied around the queen's waist, directly over her abdomen, to form a protective circle around the womb. Green jasper was another essential tool, specifically prescribed to promote conception and ensure a healthy pregnancy. Physicians would instruct that the stone be worn in direct contact with the skin, often set in a ring or pendant, to allow its virtue to be absorbed into the body. Perhaps the most literal and sought-after fertility talisman was the aetites, or eagle stone. These were naturally occurring hollow rocks, often a type of iron oxide concretion, that contained a smaller, loose stone within them. When shaken, the inner stone would rattle. The object was a perfect natural metaphor for a fetus within the womb, and by the logic of sympathetic magic, it was believed to possess a powerful ability to prevent miscarriage. The Roman author Pliny the Elder had written that eagle stones, found in eagles' nests, could secure a pregnancy if bound to the left arm of the expectant mother. Medieval physicians adopted this practice with conviction, and these stones became priceless commodities. A queen might have one bound to her thigh waist throughout the entirety of her 9-month term, a physical, rattling symbol of the life she was meant to carry. The use of animal parts followed the same logic. Objects from powerful, virile animals were thought to transfer their quality to the wearer. A piece of a stag's antler, a wolf's tooth, or the genitals of a fox might be encased in a gold or silver reliquary and worn around the neck. The power was not in the object alone but also in its preparation. To be truly effective, a talisman often had to be created or consecrated under specific astrological conditions. An astrologer-physician might instruct a goldsmith to craft a pendant of Venus, inscribed with the appropriate planetary sigils only at an hour when Venus was rising in a fertile sign, free from the malefic aspects of Saturn. This act of celestial timing was believed to capture the planetary energies within the physical object, turning a piece of metal into a charged magical battery, believing it aligned her body not just with the object's virtue, but with the very power of the heavens. These were not mere ornaments, they were a form of wearable prescription, a constant, silent application of medical magical force designed to protect her from unseen dangers and imbue her with the generative power she so desperately needed to secure her crown and her life. The protective field established by gemstones and consecrated objects was reinforced by an equivocal, albeit less tangible, form of medicine, the manipulation of scent. If the queen's body was a temple being prepared for a sacred generative act, then the air within and around it had to be ritually purified and consecrated. This focus on olfaction was not an aesthetic consideration. It was a direct and potent medical strategy, grounded firmly in the anatomical theory of the wandering womb. As we have seen, the uterus was conceived as a semi-sentient creature, driven by instinctual attractions and repulsions. Its primary sense was believed to be smell, and therefore the physician's most direct route to controlling its behavior was through the careful application of specific aromas. The overarching strategy was a coordinated, to front us all designed to herd the womb into its proper position and render it docile and receptive. This involved creating an olfactory gradient across the queen's body, a zone of repulsion at the top and a zone of profound attraction at the bottom, while the upper body was subjected to foul odors to drive the womb downward. The lower body was enveloped in a cloud of fragrant fumigation, a practice known as SUF fumigation. This was perhaps the most emblematic gynecological treatment of the era. The queen would be seated on a specially constructed chair or stool with a perforated seat. Beneath it, a brazier or censer would be placed, upon which a prescribed mixture of aromatic woods, resins, and herbs was slowly burned. The ingredients for these fumigations were chosen from the most precious and potent substances known to the medieval pharmacopoeia. They were selected for both their pleasing scent and their perceived humoral qualities, almost all of them being classified as hot and moistening. Costly imported resins like frankincense, myrrh, and labdanum were mainstays. Spices such as cinnamon and cloves, already used in the queen's diet to generate internal heat, were also burned to create a warm, stimulating external environment. Aromatic woods like sandalwood and stora X would smolder, releasing a thick, perfumed smoke. The queen would sit, often for extended periods, her lower body enveloped in these warm, medicinal vapors. The physician's intent was threefold. First, the sweet smell was a direct invitation, a fragrant lure to entice the womb animal to descend and remain contentedly in the lower abdomen. Second, the warmth of the smoke was thought to physically heat the womb, counteracting the natural coldness that was believed to cause barrenness. Third, the moisture from the vaporous smoke was intended to soften and relax a uterus that was considered too hard, dry, or closed. This external fumigation was oft unsupplemented by more direct, internal applications. Medicated pessaries would be prepared, typically consisting of a small ball of soft wool or linen soaked in a prescribed concoction and inserted into the vagina. These concoctions were intensely aromatic, often containing honey mixed with expensive scented oils, such as oil of spikenard, rose, or myrtle. The logic was the same, to deliver a potent dose of heat, moisture, and alluring fragrance as close to the target organ as possible. In addition to pessaries, the queen's lower abdomen would be massaged with perfumed unguents and salves, further saturating the region with the desired qualities. This entire process was a form of olfactory alchemy, an attempt to terraform the queen's pelvic region. The physician sought to transform it from a cold, barren wasteland into a fragrant, warm, and inviting enclosed garden where the male seed could successfully take root. In the context of the broader medical culture, which was deeply influenced by miasma theory, the belief that disease was carried by bad air, these practices had a dual purpose. The fragrant smoke was not only a targeted treatment for the womb but also a general prophylactic, purifying the air around the queen and protecting her from pestilential vapors that could cause illness and disrupt the delicate process of conception. For the queen herself, the experience was one of complete sensory saturation. Her chambers would be perpetually filled with thick, sweet smoke. Her body, her clothing, and the very air she breathed were imbued with the scent of her ongoing treatment, a constant, clawing reminder of her singular, and as yet unfulfilled, dynastic purpose. All the preceding preparations, the violent purges, the astrological timetables, and the aromatic fumigations, culminated in a single intensely scrutinized event, the royal consummation. This was not the private, intimate union of two individuals. It was the final, critical step in a lengthy medical and political procedure, and as such, it required the continued oversight of the court physician. The physician's role did not end at the bedchamber door in many respects. This was where his most immediate and high-stakes responsibilities began. His presence, whether in the room itself behind a screen, or in an adjacent antechamber with privileged access, was that of a clinical supervisor, there to ensure that the fragile alchemy of conception was not spoiled by ignorance or mishap. The physician's first duty on the wedding night was that of an advisor, providing last-minute instructions to the royal couple. These were not words of encouragement but technical directives grounded in humoral theory. To the king, the advice would be one of moderation. A king's virility was assumed, but his naturally hot and dry constitution, if overstimulated by passion or an excess of choler, could become too hot. An overly ardent approach was believed to produce scorched or adust seed, which was considered sterile and incapable of generation. The physician might prescribe a calming draught or a specific food to temper the king's heat, ensuring his contribution was potent but not destructive. His performance was under as much medical scrutiny as the queen's receptivity. The queen's instructions would be a final reinforcement of all her prior treatment. She was counseled to remain calm, passive, and receptive. Fear, anxiety, or excessive movement were believed to agitate the womb, making it close up or become slippery, causing it to expel the male seed. Her ideal state was one of placid, warm, and moist acceptance, a physical and emotional embodiment of the fertile ground prepared by weeks of medical intervention. The physician's words would be a final attempt to medically manage her state of mind, framing her emotional response as a critical component of the biological process. The second, and more public, function of the physician was that of a verifier. The consummation of a royal marriage was a legal and political necessity that required official witnesses. High-ranking members of the court, both male and female, were often required to formally attest that the act had been completed. This verification process typically centered on the ceremonial presentation of the bed linens the following morning. The blood-stained sheets served as dual proof of the queen's virginity, a crucial marker of her honor and the legitimacy of any future offspring, and of the physical completion of the marriage act. While courtiers and diplomats saw this as a political confirmation, the physician viewed the evidence through a medical lens. He was not merely a witness, he was an expert interpreter. The clinical inspection of the sheets was considered to hold prognostic value. The color and consistency of the fluids were subject to analysis, for what they might reveal about the humoral balance of the couple at the moment of union. This physical evidence, combined with witness accounts of the proceedings, provided the physician with data points. He would use this information to make an initial assessment of the likelihood of conception. The consummation was, in effect, a controlled experiment, and its immediate aftermath was the collection of the initial results. This transformation of the nuptial bed into a clinical laboratory represents the ultimate eradication of privacy for the royal couple. The physician, as the agent of both science and the state, presided over the most intimate moments of their lives, not as a voyeur, but as a technician ensuring the proper functioning of dynastic machinery. His role was to strip the act of its personal meaning and reduce it to its biological and political essence. He was there to ensure that the king's seed, a substance of immense political value, was delivered into the queen's womb, a vessel of state, under the most scientifically auspicious conditions possible. Once the act was completed and the evidence secured, the physician's role shifted once more. He had overseen the planting. Now his vigil began. He would become the primary observer of the queen's body, watching for the first subtle signs that the great experiment had succeeded. The waiting, and with it, a new and more anxious phase of medical observation had begun. The waiting, and with it, a new and more anxious phase of medical observation had begun. As the first month following the consummation gave way to the second, and then a third, with no sign of the anticipated quickening, the initial atmosphere of hopeful expectation within the court began to curdle into a palpable anxiety. The regular arrival of the Queen's menses was no longer a private, biological event. It was a public political failure, a monthly announcement that the dynastic project had stalled. The focus of the court, and most importantly, of the court physician, now shifted from hopeful preparation to urgent pathological investigation. A diagnosis was required. A reason for the Queen's apparent barrenness had to be found, codified in the language of medical science, so that a more targeted and potent remedy could be prescribed. The diagnostic process began not with the Queen herself, but with a critical, unspoken assumption: the fault was hers alone. The king's generative capacity was an extension of his political and divine authority. To question his fertility was to question the very foundation of his rule. Therefore, the queen's body became the sole object of clinical scrutiny, a complex and malfunctioning machine that the physician was tasked with deconstructing to locate the source of its failure. The first step was a comprehensive reassessment of her fundamental humoral composition. The physician would meticulously re-examine her diet, her sleep patterns, her temperament, and her excretions. Her urine would be collected and inspected daily in a clear glass flask. The physician, holding it up to the light, would analyze its color, clarity, and sediment for any deviation from the ideal, searching for signs of an unseen humoral imbalance that might have the initial preparation. This was followed by a physical examination, a procedure fraught with issues of royal decorum and clinical limitation. The physician, always male and a member of the court, would not typically perform an invasive examination himself. He would, however, conduct a careful palpation of the Queen's abdomen. With the Queen lying down, he would press his hands firmly over her lower belly, feeling for what he interpreted as signs of pathology. Was the area cold to the touch? Was there a hardness or seal rust that might indicate an obstruction or a hardened, melancholic womb? Was there an unusual swelling that might suggest a buildup of corrupt humors? These were subjective, tactile assessments, interpreted entirely through the lens of humoral theory. For a more intimate assessment, the physician relied on a proxy, a trusted and experienced midwife or a high-ranking lady-in-waiting. Acting as the physician's hands and eyes, this female attendant would perform a digital examination. The physician would stand nearby, perhaps separated by a screen, and receive her verbal report. The attendant was trained to assess a specific set of qualities. She would report on the temperature of the internal passages, whether they felt cold, suggesting a phlegmatic or melancholic nature, or excessively hot, indicating a choleric imbalance. She would describe the perceived texture of the uterine environment, reporting if it was too slippery, a sign of excessive moisture, which would prevent the seed from implanting, or too dry and parched, which would offer no nourishment. The size and position of the cervix were also assessed, with a closed or constricted cervix being a primary diagnosis for infertility. Beyond these physical assessments lay a series of diagnostic tests that blurred the line between medicine and overt magic. One of the most common was a form of fumigation test designed to determine if the Queen's internal passages were open. A pungent substance, such as garlic or asafoetida, would be placed in a pessary and inserted into the vagina. The Queen would then be asked to report if she could detect the taste or smell of the substance in her breath or mouth. It was taken as proof that her body was a continuous, open vessel, and thus capable of conception. If she could not perceive the scent, her passages were deemed blocked, a definitive diagnosis of physical obstruction. This crude test, based on a complete misunderstanding of anatomy, was a standard and respected diagnostic tool. The diagnosis, when it was finally delivered, was a clinical verdict. The physician might declare the Queen's womb to be overly cold and wet, or blocked by melancholic humors, or her passages sealed. This diagnosis, however baseless, provided a tangible enemy. It was not a message of despair, but a clinical mandate for a new and more aggressive therapeutic campaign, one that would move beyond gentle dietary adjustments and into a realm of far more invasive and dangerous interventions. With a diagnosis formally rendered, be it a cold and obstructed womb, an excess of melancholic humor, or a constriction of the internal passages, the medical campaign entered a new, more aggressive phase. The initial, gentler treatments based on diet, mild purges, and astrological timing had failed. In the rigid logic of the humoral system, this failure was not interpreted as a flaw in the underlying theory. It was taken as evidence that the Queen's pathology was more stubborn and deeply entrenched than first assumed. The imbalance was not a simple disharmony to be coaxed back into equilibrium. It was a recalcitrant, obstinate condition that now required a direct and forceful assault. The physician's strategy, therefore, escalated from systemic rebalancing to targeted, shock-based therapies. The first line of this new attack was an escalation of the pharmacopoeia. The relatively benign herbal infusions and spiced wines of the preparatory phase were replaced by more potent, and often toxic, medicinal drafts. The physician turned to a class of powerful herbs known as emmenagoges, substances known to stimulate and promote menahara. A missed period was often interpreted as a dangerous blockage. The physician reasoned that if the natural monthly purgation was obstructed, then the generative pathways must also be sealed. Therefore, provoking a strong menstrual bleed was seen as a therapeutic act of clearing the channels, violently scouring the womb of any stagnant, corrupt humors that were preventing conception. The queen was prescribed powerful concoctions containing herbs such as mugwort, penurial tansy, and savin. These were not administered in gentle tonic doses. They were given in high concentrations, designed to provoke a powerful physiological reaction. The bitter, acrid taste of these medicines was often seen as a sign of their potency. The irony, lost to the pre-modern physician, is that these herbs are potent abortifacients, the very treatments prescribed to promote fertility in a queen who might have, by chance, recently conceived, were the most effective agents for terminating that nascent pregnancy. The cramping, bleeding, and visceral sickness induced by these potions were not seen as signs of poisoning, but as evidence that the medicine was working, that the blockage was being powerfully and successfully purged. The second front of this escalated assault was on the exterior of the queen's body. The gentle warming of aromatic fumigation was now deemed insufficient. A more intense and penetrating heat was required to combat the diagnosed coldness of the womb. The physician prescribed the application of vesicatory plasters, caustic poultices directly to the queen's lower abdomen and back. These were thick pastes containing powerful irritants, such as mustard seed or, most famously, cantharides, powdered blister beetle, commonly known as Spanish fly. When applied to the skin, these agents would cause severe inflammation, redness, and the formation of large, painful blisters. This procedure, known as counter-irritation, was a mainstream and respected medical practice. The theory held that the blisters acted as a physical outlet for the body's deep-seated evils. The clear or yellowish fluid that filled them was believed to be the corrupt humor itself, the excess phlegm or melancholy, being drawn out from the afflicted organ below and expelled from the body. For the queen, this meant enduring hours or even days with a burning, blistering plaster affixed to her skin. The resulting open sores were often dressed with further irritating ointments to encourage them to weep, prolonging the curative drainage. The constant pain was interpreted as a sign of the fierce battle being waged between the remedy and the disease. It was a painful but necessary process to apply a fire to the outside of the body in order to rekindle the generative fire that was thought to be extinguished within. This escalation from gentle persuasion to outright assault marked a critical turning point in the queen's ordeal. Her body was no longer a garden to be cultivated but a fortress to be besieged. The treatments were becoming more painful, more debilitating, and significantly more dangerous, introducing the very real risks of systemic poisoning and severe infection. For the queen, trapped between the political certainty of ruin and the increasingly dubious promise of a medical cure, there was little choice but to submit. Her compliance was born of a desperate calculus of risk, a political imperative that overrode any consideration of her own physical suffering or well-being. The external application of blistering agents and the systemic shock of purgative herbs represented only one axis of the escalated therapeutic assault. While these treatments sought to draw out corrupt humors from a distance or flush them from the system, the diagnostic focus on a specific, localized pathology, the womb itself, demanded a more direct approach. If the queen's infertility was caused by a physical obstruction, a coldness, or a contamination within the pelvic region, the physician reasoned that the most effective cure must be one applied directly to the site of the disease. The assault now moved from the body's periphery to its most intimate interior spaces, employing a series of invasive procedures that transformed the therapeutic process into a profound physical violation. The pessary, once a simple vehicle for pleasant aromas, was now re-engineered as a direct delivery system for potent, and often caustic, medicaments. The soft wool ball soaked in perfumed oil was replaced by formulations designed to actively provoke a reaction from the uterine environment. These new pessaries were compounded with a range of aggressive ingredients. Astringent substances like alumortin in rich oak oils were included to dry a wound diagnosed as excessively wet or slippery. For a wound deemed to dry and closed, emollients like goose fat or clarified butter were mixed with herbs intended to soften and open the passages. More aggressively, irritating resins like myrrh and galbanum, or mineral salts like init and naturally occurring sodium carbonate or potassium nitrate were incorporated. The medical objective of these irritants was to stimulate a discharge, which was interpreted as a therapeutic purging of stagnant, corrupt humors that were clogging the womb. The queen would be required to retain these pessaries for hours or even days, enduring the internal discomfort and inflammation as a sign that the medicine was performing its necessary, scouring work. Alongside this, the practice of SUF fumigation was intensified. The sweet, warming smoke of frankincense and cinnamon was deemed insufficient for a truly stubborn case. It was replaced by the acrid, penetrating fumes of mineral substances, which were believed to possess a far more potent purifying undesiccating virtue. The physician might prescribe the burning of sulfur, whose choking fumes were thought to be a powerful agent against internal corruption and excessive moisture. Arsenic sulfides, such as the bright red real gar or yellow orpiment, were also used. These were potent poisons, but in the alchemical and medical thinking of the time, their toxicity was synonymous with their power. The fumes were thought to penetrate deep into the body, fumigating the womb and destroying any putrefaction or cold phlegm within. The method of delivery also became more invasive. Rather than simply sitting over a brazier, the queen might be made to use a funnel or pipe, directing the thick, toxic smoke more precisely towards the vaginal opening, ensuring a concentrated dose was delivered to the target area. The final frontier of this invasive therapy was the direct irrigation of the internal passages. This procedure employed a metal or bone syringe, an instrument known as a C-lister, more commonly used for administering enemas. For gynecological use, it was repurposed to inject medicinal fluids directly into the vagina. The objective was a mechanical scouring, a physical flushing of the uterine pathways. The liquids used were as varied as the diagnoses they were meant to treat. A simple irrigation might use a decoction of astringent herbs in wine or vinegar, intended to cleanse and strengthen the tissues. For a diagnosed blockage, more powerful solutions were prescribed. These could be formulated with saponifying agents, like solutions of ash lye, intended to dissolve the thick, greasy humors believed to be the cause of the obstruction. This regimen represented the ultimate physical manifestation of medical theory. Conceptualized as a blocked-in contaminated vessel, was subjected to a series of increasingly violent attempts to unstop it, scour it, and purify it by force. For the woman enduring these treatments, the distinction between cure and punishment would have been academic. The risk of introducing infection, causing chemical burns, or inducing systemic poisoning was immense, a danger entirely invisible to the physician who administered these cures with the full, unwavering confidence of his science. For years, the Queen's body had been the sole theatre of medical inquiry, a landscape to be mapped, purged, and terraformed. Every failure to conceive was inscribed upon her as a personal, biological, and political failing. Yet, in the most protracted and desperate of dynastic crises, after years of failed pregnancies, after the dismissal of one queen and the subsequent barrenness of a second, the clinical gaze would, on the rarest of occasions, pivot. This was a moment of profound medical and political gravity, an almost heretical shift in focus. It was the point at which, all other possibilities having been exhausted, the physician was forced to consider the unthinkable, that the generative fault might lie not in the fertile field, but in the royal seed itself. This was not an inquiry undertaken lightly. The king's virility was inextricably bound to his persona as a monarch. His potency was a symbol of his kingdom's strength, his physical prowess a reflection of his divine mandate to rule and to propagate his line. To suggest that the king was infertile was tantamount to suggesting he was unfit to wear the crown. Therefore, any investigation into the male factor had to be framed with the utmost delicacy. The physician would never diagnose the king as barren. Instead, he would frame the inquiry as an effort to perfect, enhance, or optimize the king's already assumed generative power. The problem was not a fundamental lack, but a subtle humoral imbalance in the seed that rendered it less than ideally effective. The theoretical framework for male infertility was a direct corollary of the dynastic system that governed the female body. The ideal male seed was believed to be a concentrate of the most potent humors, primarily blood and innate heat, transformed into a white, viscous substance by the testes. Its generative power resided in its vital heat, the active, animating principle that could quicken the passive, cold matter provided by the woman. Any deviation from this ideal state, caused by a humoral imbalance in the king, would result in defective seed. A king with a choleric, hot and dry excess might produce seed that was adust or scorched, too thin, too hot, and lacking the necessary substance to properly coagulate and form a fetus. It was thought this type of seed could even burn the womb, making it hostile to future attempts. Conversely, a king with a phlegmatic, cold and moist, or melancholic, cold and dry, disposition might produce seed that was cold, thick, viscous, or watery. This seed was believed to lack the essential vital heat, rendering it sluggish, inert, and incapable of imparting life. The diagnostic process was, by necessity, one of direct, macroscopic observation. The physician would request a sample of the royal semen, typically collected on a clean linen cloth following intercourse. In a private chamber, away from the prying eyes of the court, he would conduct his analysis. This was a purely sensory examination. He would first observe its color. The ideal was a pure, pearly white. A yellowish tinge might suggest an excess of chola, while a grayish or watery appearance could indicate an ominence of phlegm. Next, he would assess its consistency or viscosity. It should be thick enough to be retained by the womb, but not so clotted as to be immobile. A seed that was too thin and ran freely from the cloth was deemed ineffective. Finally, he would judge its spiritual quality by observing its warmth and frothy. A sample that retained its heat for a long time and appeared frothy, or bubbly, was considered full of pneuma or vital spirit, a sign of great potency. A sample that cooled quickly was seen as lacking the necessary generative fire. Once a diagnosis was rendered, an excess of choleric heat in the seed, for example, a course of treatment for the king would be prescribed. This regimen mirrored the queen's, but was calibrated for a male constitution. If the king's seed was deemed too hot, he would be advised to abstain from heating foods like garlic, onions, and spices. He would be encouraged to consume cooling items like lettuce, melons, and barley water. His intake of red wine would be restricted, and he might even be advised to undergo a mild bloodletting to reduce his overall plethora and cool his blood. If the seed was diagnosed as too cold and sluggish, the opposite prescription would apply. The king would be placed on a heating diet rich in red meat, strong wine, and potent spices. He would be encouraged to engage in vigorous physical exercise, such as hunting or riding, to build his innate heat. Specific aphrodisiacs and herbs, thought to enhance virility, such as satyrion, orchids, or rockets, would be added to his diet. In these rare moments, the king himself became a patient. However, it must be stressed that this investigation was almost always an adjunct to, and never a replacement for, the ongoing treatment of the queen. The assumption of female deficiency was so deeply woven into the fabric of medical and cultural thought that even when the male factor was under direct scrutiny, the queen's painful and invasive ordeal would invariably continue. Only temporarily shared, while the physician scrutinized the king's seed and subjected the queen to a battery of invasive treatments, the waiting continued. Each month that passed without a sign of pregnancy intensified the pressure for a definitive sign, a glimmer of hope or a final verdict of failure. In this climate of heightened anxiety, the most significant diagnostic event, short of a visible swelling of the queen's belly, was the analysis of her urine. The practice of uroscopy, or water casting, was not merely one diagnostic tool among many. It was considered the pinnacle of medical diagnosis, a window into the body's most secret operations. The court physician was often referred to colloquially as a piss prophet, a title that, while seemingly coarse, accurately reflected the immense authority and prognostic power attributed to his analysis of this single bodily fluid. Following any period of potential conception, the queen's morning urine would be collected with near-ceremonial gravity. It was decanted into a special flask, a clear glass flask whose shape was thought to mimic the human torso. This was not a mere container, it was a diagnostic instrument. The physician would receive the sample and begin his examination, a process of meticulous, multisensory inspection that could take a considerable amount of time. He would never simply glance at the fluid. The analysis was a structured four-part ritual, assessing the color, the consistency, the sediment, and, in some cases, the smell and even the taste. The first and most important element was color. An elaborate color wheel, often depicted in medical manuscripts, codified at least 20 different shades of urine, from a pale, whitish yellow to a deep, ominous black, each with a specific diagnostic meaning. For a pregnancy diagnosis, the physician was looking for a very particular shade. According to leading medical texts, the urine of a pregnant woman would be a pale, whitish citron color, often with a slight cloudiness floating near the surface, likened to a skein of carded wool. This specific visual cue was the most sought-after sign. Next came the assessment of consistency and sediment. The physician would hold the clear glass flask up to the light, swirling it gently. He observed the fluid's thickness or viscosity, and watched how any suspended particles behaved. After a period of time, the flask would be left to stand, allowing any sediment to settle in the rounded bottom of the flask, which corresponded to the bladder or womb. This sediment was of critical importance. In a pregnant woman, it was believed that tiny, white, granular particles, sometimes described as resembling ground barley, would be visible. This was interpreted as physical evidence of the generative process, a byproduct of the coagulation of the male and female contributions into the beginnings of a fetus. This purely visual inspection was sometimes supplemented by other sensory data. The physician might unstopper the flask and note the odor. A sweetish smell was sometimes associated with pregnancy. In the most thorough of examinations, a physician might even perform a taste test, dipping a finger into the urine. A sweet taste would later be correctly identified as a key symptom of diabetes mellitus, the honey disease, but in the pre-modern context, any deviation from the normal taste was simply another data point to be factored into the overall humoral diagnosis. Based on this complex matrix of observations, the physician would render his verdict. He might declare that the signs were favorable and the conception had likely occurred. This news would be met with cautious jubilation in the court, though it would only be confirmed by a missed period and, eventually, a visible pregnancy. More often, the urine would present an ambiguous or negative picture. The physician might diagnose a coldness of the kidneys or a superfluity of phlegm, sending the queen back for another round of purgations or dietary adjustments. The tragic flaw in this entire elaborate science was its complete lack of empirical validity. The visual characteristics of urine are affected by diet, hydration levels, and a host of unrelated medical conditions. There is no consistent, observable change in urine in the early weeks of pregnancy that could be reliably detected by these methods. The piss prophets were, in essence, reading omens in a flask, interpreting random biological variations through the rigid filter of their theoretical expectations. Yet, their authority was a devastating blow, plunging the Queen and her supporters into despair and signaling another cycle of medical failure. A positive verdict, however fleeting, provided a crucial political reprieve. It bought time, sustained hope, and reaffirmed the physician's expertise, even if that expertise was based on an entirely illusory science. The meticulous, if flawed, science of uroscopy represented one pillar of the diagnostic and therapeutic structure. But as the months turned into years, and the physician's arsenal of purges, potions, and plasters failed to yield a result, the court would increasingly invest its resources in the other, co-equal pillar of power, the church. In the medieval and early modern mind, medicine and faith were not competing systems but a deeply integrated continuum. A physical ailment was never merely a physical ailment, it was also a reflection of one's spiritual state. Infertility, in particular, was seen as a condition with profound theological implications. It could be a trial sent by God to test the Queen's faith. More ominously, it could be a punishment for a hidden sin, either her own or the king's, or a sign that the entire kingdom had fallen from divine favor. Therefore, the battle for an heir had to be waged simultaneously on two fronts, the physical and the metaphysical. The court physician would continue his work, but now the royal confessor, the bishops, and the entire ecclesiastical establishment would be mobilized in a parallel, and often more public, campaign. The first line of this spiritual assault was directed prayer and the veneration of saints. The Queen's private piety, once a personal matter, was now transformed into a public and politically significant performance. She would spend hours in her private chapel, her prayers amplified by the knowledge that the fate of the dynasty rested upon their efficacy. However, this was not a generalized appeal to the divine. It was a highly targeted campaign, focusing on specific celestial intercessors who had jurisdiction over fertility, childbirth, and the protection of mothers. The most powerful of these was Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary. According to apocryphal tradition, Anne and her husband Joachim were themselves barren for many years before an angel announced that they would conceive a child who would be known throughout the world. For an infertile queen, Saint Anne was the ultimate patron, a woman who understood the shame and sorrow of childlessness and who had been granted a miraculous conception by God. Vows were made to Saint Anne, chapels were dedicated in her name, and her feast day was observed with particular solemnity at court. Another critical figure in this celestial court was Saint Margaret of Antioch, a virgin martyr whose legend contained a powerful and literal story of successful delivery. According to her hagiography, Margaret was swallowed whole by a dragon representing Satan. Making the sign of the cross from within the beast's belly, the dragon's stomach burst open, and she emerged unharmed. This graphic tale made her the preeminent patron saint of childbirth, invoked to ensure a safe delivery and, by extension, a successful conception. The Queen would possess illuminated manuscripts depicting Margaret's life, and her name would be invoked in endless litanies. These were not abstract devotions. They were seen as direct appeals to powerful allies in the heavenly court, patrons who could petition God on the Queen's behalf. When prayer alone proved insufficient, a more direct and physical form of spiritual medicine was employed, the application of holy relics. These were the physical remains of saints, bones, hair, or clothing, believed to be imbued with their miraculous power. For a high-ranking royal, the most potent relics in Christendom could be requested and brought to the court. The most sought after of these for matters of fertility was the girdle of the Virgin Mary, a belt said to have been worn by the Mother of God herself. This relic, or rather several relics in different churches that claimed authenticity, was considered a spiritual tool of immense power. With great ceremony, it would be brought to the Queen. She might be required to wear it, tying it around her waist so its sacred virtue could be physically absorbed, protecting her womb and promoting conception. This act was layered with political significance, a public demonstration that the monarchy had access to the highest levels of divine favor. Other relics, such as a fragment of the bone of Saint Anne or a tooth of Saint Margaret, would be housed in precious reliquaries and placed in the Queen's chamber, or even sewn into the fabric of her mattress. Finally, if the saints and their relics remained deaf to the entreaties made within the palace walls, the Queen herself would be sent out on a pilgrimage. This was the ultimate act of public piety and personal penance. A royal pilgrimage was a massive undertaking. As shrines like that of Our Lady of Walsingham in England or Rocamadour in France were famous throughout Europe for the fertility miracles attributed to them, the Queen would travel for days or weeks, making a public spectacle of her devotion. Upon arrival, she would make a lavish offering, gold, jewels, or land, to the shrine, a spiritual transaction to secure the saint's favor. She would spend hours or even days in prayer before the shrine's central statue or relic. This act served a dual purpose. It was a final, desperate appeal to the divine, but it was also a piece of political theater, demonstrating to the king's subjects that their queen was a pious woman, undeserving of the curse of barrenness, and that the monarchy was leaving no stone, earthly or heavenly, unturned in its quest for an heir. While the Queen embarked on these public pilgrimages and the court engaged in a grand spiritual campaign, the royal physician did not stand idle. The failure of divine intercession was not interpreted as a sign to cease medical efforts, but rather as a mandate to redouble them. to push the material science to its absolute limits. In this final, desperate stage of treatment, the physician turned to the most potent and dangerous substances in his pharmacopoeia. These were the heroic remedies, reserved for the most intractable of cases, where the body's pathology was so profound that only a medicine of commensurate power could hope to overcome it. It is here, in this realm of extreme materia medica, that the line between a cure and a poison effectively dissolved. The critical distinction, entirely absent from the pre-modern medical mind, was that of dosage. In a world without standardized measures or an understanding of biochemistry, the difference between a therapeutic shock and a fatal overdose was a matter of chance, dictated by the freshness of an herb or the impression of a pinch. The emmenagogues prescribed to clear the channels, such as penurial and savin, were revisited, but in far more concentrated forms. The active chemical compounds in these plants, pulgon and sabini, are potent hepatotoxins and neurotoxins. In high doses, they do not merely stimulate uterine contractions, they induce violent convulsions, kidney and liver failure, and ultimately death. The severe cramping and bleeding that followed their administration, seen by the physician as a successful purging of the womb, were in fact the initial stages of systemic poisoning. The queen was, in effect, being subjected to a controlled, sublethal dose of a substance that was destroying her organs. The physician's cabinet also contained a host of even more explicitly toxic botanicals. Hellebore, a plant with a notorious reputation since antiquity, was a favored tool for the most severe purges. It was considered the ultimate remedy for an excess of black bile, the cold, dry humor of melancholy. A queen suffering from the profound depression that often accompanied her public failure might be diagnosed with a melancholic obstruction of the womb and prescribed a draught of hellebore. The resulting physiological reaction was horrific, violent, controllable diarrhea, and a dangerously slowed heart rate. Its neurotoxic properties could also induce vertigo and collapse. The physician, observing this near-total systemic shutdown, would interpret it not as poisoning, but as the powerful, and therefore successful, expulsion of the melancholic humor that was poisoning the patient from within. The true vanguard of this toxic therapy, however, lay in the mineral and metallic kingdom. These substances, derived from the earth through the processes of alchemy, were believed to possess a power and purity that surpassed that of plants. Mercury, in the form of mercure, OUS chloride, calomel, or other compounds, was a key weapon. As a purgative, it was unparalleled in its violence, causing profuse salivation, severe intestinal cramping, and bloody diarrhea. These dramatic effects were seen as proof of its profound ability to scour the body of all humoral corruption. The long-term consequences of this treatment, neurological damage, kidney destruction, loss of teeth and hair, were the slow, creeping symptoms of chronic heavy metal poisoning. Arsenic, another substance of immense power, was used more cautiously, but was by no means off limits. In minute quantities, it was sometimes included in tonic preparations. An overdose, easy to administer accidentally, would lead to excruciating gastrointestinal pain, vomiting, and a rapid, agonizing death. Antimony, a metalloid, was also a popular emetic. It was often administered via an antimonial cup, a cup made of the metal, in which wine was left to stand overnight. The wine would absorb traces of the antimony, creating a potent solution that induced violent and prolonged vomiting. The goal was to shock the system into a state of balance, but the risk of a fatal overdose was ever present. The central and tragic irony of this entire phase of treatment is that the physician interpreted the symptoms of poisoning as signs of a cure. The sicker the queen became from the remedy, the more she vomited, purged or convulsed, the more confident the physician grew that his powerful medicine was successfully battling her deep-seated disease. The queen's body became the unwitting laboratory for a deadly experiment, a battleground where the cures were often far more lethal than the supposed affliction they were meant to treat. In the desperate, high-stakes quest to create a new life, the court turned to the very agents of death, deploying them with the full and unwavering sanction of the era's most advanced medical science. While the material poisons coursed deep through the queen's veins, attacking her liver and kidneys, a more insidious, unarguably more destructive process was underway. The relentless physical assault on her body, framed as a heroic medical campaign, was mirrored by an equally relentless psychological assault on her mind. The suffering inflicted by the medieval fertility regimen was not confined to the pain of the blister plaster or the agony of the purgative draught. It was a profound and systemic torment that aimed to deconstruct her sense of self, her agency, and her sanity, leaving behind only a pliant vessel for the dynastic will. The psychological sequelae of these treatments were not an unfortunate side effect. They were an inherent part of the cure's brutal logic. The queen lived in a state of perpetual, inescapable surveillance. From the moment she entered the court as a new bride, she was the object of an unblinking, collective gaze. Her ladies-in-waiting were not confidants but informants, tasked with monitoring the intimate details of her daily life, her appetite, her complexion, the timing and nature of her monthly courses. Every piece of information was relayed, analyzed, and integrated into the broader political and medical narrative of her body. This constant scrutiny created a panopticon of the court, a prison in which the walls were made of watching eyes and whispering voices. There was no privacy, no space for personal grief or doubt. Her body was public property, its successes and failures debated in the council chamber and reported in diplomatic dispatches. This complete erosion of a private self was the first stage in her psychological unraveling. The second stage was a profound sense of bodily alienation. The queen's physical form, the very thing that defined her existence, was systematically redefined as a defective and untrustworthy object. It was not hers to command. It was a clinical territory, mapped, invaded, and controlled by the male physician. His hands, or those of his female proxies, palpated and probed her. His instruments and concoctions were inserted into her. His theories dictated what she ate, when she slept, and how she must conduct herself in the marital bed. This relentless objectification would have induced a state of deep estrangement from her own flesh. Her body was no longer a source of identity or pleasure, but a source of shame, a treacherous vessel that refused to perform its duty, and a site of constant, medically sanctioned violation. Layered upon this alienation was the crushing weight of blame. The entire intellectual framework of the era was structured to place the burden of infertility squarely upon her. The king's virility was a political axiom. The physician's medical theories were considered infallible scientific law. The will of God was absolute. When a pregnancy failed to occur, there was only one variable left to blame, a flaw within the queen. She was the single point of failure in an otherwise perfect system. This message was reinforced from every corner, from the physician's diagnoses of her cold and obstructed womb, from the priest's sermons on penance and divine punishment, and from the king's growing impatience and displeasure. This external blame would inevitably be internalized, metastasizing into a deep and corrosive sense of personal guilt, inadequacy, and worthlessness. She had failed her husband, her kingdom, and her God. This ongoing trauma was structured into a relentless cycle of hope and despair, a form of recurring psychological torture. Each month offered a brief, fragile window of possibility. The end of her menses, the astrologically favorable nights, the administration of a new and promising remedy, all would conspire to build a desperate hope. For a few weeks, the court would hold its breath. Then, the inevitable arrival of her next period would dash those hopes to pieces, plunging her back into a state of public failure and personal despair. This was not a single disappointment but a repeating, predictable trauma, a monthly reenactment of her inadequacy. This emotional whiplash, this constant oscillation between desperate hope and crushing certainty, was psychologically devastating, designed to break even the strongest resolve and foster a state of complete dependency on the very authorities who were tormenting her. When the physician's pharmacopoeia was exhausted and the saints remained silent, when the most violent purges and the most sacred relics had all failed to produce an heir, the intellectual and political framework of the court entered its final and most dangerous stage. The persistent failure of both science and faith created a profound explanatory vacuum. The king was, by definition, potent. The medical system was by dogma, correct. The Christian God was, by faith, just. Yet the dynastic project remained a catastrophic failure. Then the cause could not be natural or divine. It had to be unnatural and diabolical. The queen's barrenness, ceased to be a medical pathology. It was re-diagnosed as an act of supernatural malevolence. The long, slow slide from clinical subject to political liability now accelerated into a terrifying descent from patient to heretic. The intellectual groundwork for this transition was already well established in the theological and legal thought of the era. The concept of destructive magic was a recognized crime, and one of its most commonly cited manifestations was the power to cause impotence in men and sterility in women. Learned treatises like the infamous The Hammer of Witches dedicated entire sections to the methods by which witches, in league with demons, could tie the knot or freeze the generative members, magically obstructing the act of procreation. This was not folk superstition, it was codified, university-sanctioned demonology. For a court desperate for an explanation and a solution, this provided a ready-made and terrifyingly convenient script. This new diagnostic framework served the interests of every powerful faction at court. For the king, it was the ultimate political tool. It transformed him from a weak, unfortunate, airless monarch into the righteous victim of a satanic conspiracy against his sacred bloodline. An annulment on the grounds of barrenness could be a lengthy, ecclesiastical-like complicated process. An accusation of witchcraft, however, was an accusation of high treason against both the state and God, a crime for which the penalty was swift and final. It provided an unimpeachable justification for setting aside the queen and taking a new wife, all while burnishing the king's image as a defender of the faith. For the core physician, this narrative offered a complete absolution of his medical failures. His remedies had not been ineffective, they had been battling against a power far beyond the scope of natural philosophy. He had been attempting to cure a natural body, while the truer fiction was a supernatural curse. The very resistance of the queen's body to his most potent cures was reframed, no longer as a sign of a stubborn pathology, but as evidence of an unnatural fortitude, a resilience rooted not in health but in a diabolical compact. His reputation was not only saved, it was enhanced. He had been on the front lines, the first to grapple with the evidence of this dark magic. The evidence for such an accusation was not discovered, it was constructed. The entire history of the Queen's life at court was now re-examined through this dark new lens. Her foreign accent, her unfamiliar customs, her reliance on a retinue of ladies in waiting from her homeland, once seen as simple matters of courtly integration, were now reinterpreted as signs of an alien and potentially heretical nature. Did she possess a knowledge of herbs, perhaps for her own cosmetic or minor medicinal use? This was now twisted into evidence of her skill in concocting malevolent potions. The talismans and amulets prescribed by her own physician to promote fertility were now presented as instruments of witchcraft. Her moments of private prayer or her public displays of piety were recast as hypocritical performances, a cloak of holiness to hide a pact with the devil. Any stillbirths or miscarriages were no longer tragic biological events, they were held up as monstrous, demonic births, the horrific fruit of her unholy alliance. The queen was trapped in a hermeneutic circle of guilt. Every aspect of her life, every action she had ever taken, was now recontextuated as an exhibit in the case against her. The transition was complete. The clinical gaze of the physician, with his clear glass flask and his lancet, was replaced by the inquisitorial glare of the prosecutor, with his instruments of torture and his demand for a confession. No historical case serves as a more potent, meticulously documented illustration of this lethal trajectory, from royal patient to political obstacle, than that of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VII of England. Her 23-year marriage was not a simple story of love turned to disregard, it was a protracted and public medical crisis, a relentless, decade-long campaign to secure the Tudor dynasty that deployed the full, combined arsenal of humoral medicine and divine intercession. Her body became a clinical and spiritual battleground, and her ultimate failure to produce a male heir would not only lead to her personal ruin but would also rupture the religious and political fabric of Western Christendom. Catherine arrived in England as the ultimate dynastic prize, the daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand I of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs who had unified Spain. Her bloodline was impeccable. She was pious, educated, and, by all accounts, healthy. The pressure on her was immediate and immense. The Tudor dynasty, established by Henry V, Ionia generation earlier after the bloody Wars of the Roses, had a notoriously tenuous claim to the throne. It was the sole guarantee against a relapse into civil war. Initially, all signs were favorable. After her marriage to Henry V, II in 1509, she conceived quickly. On January 1st, 1511, she gave birth to a son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall. The kingdom celebrated. The Tudor succession seemed secure. But the infant died just 52 days later, and with his death, the Queen's long ordeal truly began. What followed was a tragic and relentless litany of reproductive failure, a near-constant cycle of pregnancy, hope, and loss that was played out on the public stage of the English court. Her reproductive history, meticulously chronicled by court observers and ambassadors, became a grim catalogue: a miscarried daughter in 1510, the death of the infant Duke of Cornwall in 1511, a stillborn son in 1513, another miscarried son in 1514, in 1516. She finally delivered a healthy child, a daughter named Mary. While the birth of a living child was a relief, it was not the required solution. A female heir was a problematic and vulnerable successor. The cycle continued. In 1518, she suffered another miscarriage, this one of a daughter. After this, her pregnancy ceased altogether. Throughout this entire period, Catherine was subjected to the full regimen of the medical and spiritual cures of her day. Her renowned piety was weaponized in the service of her fertility. She made public pilgrimages to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsmanhand, a site famed for granting miracles of conception. She prayed, she fasted, and she solicited the intercession of every relevant saint in the celestial roster. Concurrently, the royal physicians, both English and Spanish, attended her. Her diet was medically managed to promote a warm and moist humoral balance. She would have endured the purges, the bloodletting and the aromatic fumigation deemed necessary to correct her body's perceived deficiencies. Every aspect of her life was medicalized in the desperate pursuit of a son. As the years of failure mounted, however, the diagnostic framework began to shift, driven by the king's increasing desperation and theological anxiety. The problem was no longer seen as a simple case of a cold or obstructed womb that could be corrected by medicine. Henry began to seek a different kind of diagnosis, one that was not medical but moral and divine. He found his justification in a passage from the Old Testament, specifically Leviticus 20:21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Catherine had, for a brief period before his death, been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Although a papal dispensation had been granted for Henry to marry his brother's widow, the king now seized upon this biblical prohibition as the true cause of his dynastic crisis. This theological re-diagnosis was a masterstroke of political expediency. It shifted the blame from a medical failure on Catherine's part, which was pitiable, to a state of sin, in which they were both complicit, but for which she was the living symbol. Her body's refusal to produce a son was no longer a biological failing, it was the physical manifestation of God's curse upon their illicit union. This accusation of living in a state of mortal sin served the exact same political purpose. It rendered her an illegitimate queen and an unfit vessel for the royal succession. The long, painful history of her medical treatments was now erased, replaced by a single damning and unassailable verdict of divine condemnation. The case of Catherine of Aragon, with her retinue of university-trained male physicians, highlights a crucial and parallel development in the history of this medical ordeal: the systematic marginalization and professional exclusion of the traditional female healer. For centuries, the practical arts of gynecology and obstetrics had been the exclusive domain of women. The midwife was not merely a birth attendant, she was the community's primary expert on the female body, a repository of empirical, generationally transmitted knowledge about menstruation, conception, pregnancy, and childbirth. Her authority was rooted in direct, hands-on experience. She had seen, touched, and managed the realities of female reproductive life in a way no male physician ever could. However, the rise of the university-trained, text-based medical professional during the late medieval and early modern periods created a new hierarchy of knowledge, one that deliberately unsystematically devalued this experiential wisdom in favor of abstract, theoretical, and exclusively male-authored dogma. The university as an institution was a bastion of male privilege and clerical culture. Women were barred from entry. The language of higher learning was Latin, a tongue inaccessible to all but a tiny elite of educated men. The curriculum was based on the canonical text of Hippocrates, Galen, and their Arab and European commentators. To become a licensed physician, a man had to demonstrate his mastery of this textual tradition, not his practical skill at the bedside. It was no longer based on what one had done, but on what one had read. The male physician's claim to expertise was rooted in his literacy and his access to an exclusive body of ancient knowledge, a body of knowledge that treated the female body not as a familiar territory, but as a flawed, mysterious, and inherently pathological deviation from the male norm. This new class of professional men looked upon the traditional midwife with a mixture of condescension and suspicion. Her knowledge, derived from experience rather than from sanctioned texts, was dismissed as unlearned, empirical guesswork, a collection of old wives' tales. Her methods, often involving herbal remedies and physical manipulations, passed down through generations, were seen as crude and unscientific when compared to the elegant, systematic philosophy of the four humors. The physician, with his complex astrological charts and his Galenic terminology, presented himself as a practitioner of a higher, more intellectual form of medicine. He treated the queen. The midwife delivered the commoner. This professional struggle was not merely about status. It was a battle for control over the lucrative and politically crucial domain of royal health. As medicine became more deeply integrated into the power structures of the court, the male physician who could move freely in the male-dominated worlds of politics and academia had a decisive advantage. He could converse with the king and his counselors as a peer, framing his medical advice in the language of statecraft and high theory. Typically from a lower social class and excluded from these circles, could not. The result was a gradual but decisive takeover. The care of the royal womb, once a matter for women, was now entrusted to men who, in many cases, had never witnessed a birth and whose understanding of female anatomy was based on profoundly flawed, thousand-year-old texts. This professional schism also took on a more sinister dimension, particularly as the fear of witchcraft intensified. The midwife's intimate knowledge of the female body and her use of herbal remedies made her a figure of immense power, but also of immense suspicion. She worked at the charged and mysterious threshold of life and death. If a child was born healthy, she was praised. But if a child was born healthy, she was praised. But if a child, or if a mother died in childbirth, or if a woman remained barren, the midwife was a convenient scapegoat. Her knowledge of herbs could be reinterpreted as a knowledge of poisons. Her incantations, meant to soothe a laboring woman, could be twisted into demonic invocations. The hammer of witches specifically identified midwives as being particularly susceptible to the temptations of the devil, accusing them of using their skills to cause miscarriages and offer newborn infants to demons. The rise of the male physician, therefore, was not just a professional ascendancy. It was part of a broader cultural campaign to pathologize and control female knowledge and agency. By entrusting the queen's body to the scientific authority of the male physician, the court was not only seeking a cure for infertility, it was also asserting a new model of patriarchal control over the very sources of life itself. For centuries, the medical practices visited upon the royal body had been built upon a foundation of absolute, unquestioned anatomical dogma. The wandering womb, the humoral properties of organs, the very mechanics of conception, all word arrived from a single, canonical source, the writings of Galen. His descriptions of the human body were not treated as a scientific text to be tested and revised, but as a sacred text to be memorized and revered. This intellectual fealty was so profound that if a dissected body appeared to contradict the words of Galen, it was the body, not the text, that was assumed to be in error, a freakish anomaly. But in the intellectual crucible of the mid-16th century, amidst the Renaissance's fervent discovery of classical learning, and its burgeoning spirit of direct inquiry, a single man would take a scalpel to this millennium-old foundation, and in doing so, painful process of its demolition. His name was Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish-born anatomist and physician who, by the 1532s, had become a professor at the University of Padua, then the premier medical school in Europe. The anatomical theatre of his time was a rigid, hierarchical affair. The professor, robed and elevated in a high chair, would read aloud from a Latin translation of Galen. Below him, a lowly barber surgeon, considered a manual labourer rather than a scholar, would perform the actual cutting on the corpse of an executed criminal. The anatomist's role was not to discover, but to demonstrate the pre-existing truths found in the ancient text. Vesalius, in a revolutionary break with this tradition, descended from the chair. He took the knife into his own hands. He believed that the only true source of anatomical knowledge was not the venerated page, but the human body itself, directly observed. This simple, yet profound, shift from textual authority to empirical observation culminated in 1543, with the publication of his masterwork, On the Fabrique was a monumental achievement. A work that fused art and science in a way never before seen. Its more than 200 detailed, high-quality woodcut illustrations, rendered with stunning realism, set a new standard for medical publishing. But its true revolutionary power lay in its content. Vesalius meticulously unsystematically corrected the errors of Galen, errors that had been propagated, unquestioned, for over 1300 years. He demonstrated that the human jawbone, not two as Galen had claimed for the ape. He showed that the human breastbone had 3 segments, not 7 like a monkey's. He proved there were no pores in the septum of the heart allowing blood to pass between the ventricles. Critically for the history of gynecology, Vesalius turned his empirical gaze upon the female reproductive system. Here he exposed 2 of the most foundational errors upon which the entire edifice of fertility treatment had been built. First, he addressed the anatomy of the uterus itself. Galen, whose dissections were limited to animals such as pigs, goats, and Barbary macaques, had described and drawn a bicorn weight or 2-horned uterus for centuries. Every medical text in Europe had dutifully reproduced this animalistic anatomy. Vesalius, working from human corpses, corrected the record. His illustrations in the Fabrique show, for the first time in print, the pear-shaped, single-chambered human uterus as it actually exists. This was not a minor correction. It was a direct, visual refutation of the ancient concept of the womb as an animal-like organ. Second, and perhaps more devastatingly, his careful dissections completely dismantled the theory of the wandering womb. He traced the complex and powerful network of ligaments, the broad ligament, the round ligaments, that anchor the uterus firmly within the pelvic cavity. He demonstrated conclusively that it was not a free-floating, mobile organ capable of traveling to the throat or head. It was a fixed, stable part of the anatomy, rendered obsolete centuries of therapeutic practice. The entire elaborate science of olfactory control, the foul-smelling potions to drive the wound down, the sweet fumigationess to lure it back into place, was revealed to be utterly baseless, a phantasmagoric treatment for a non-existent condition. The publication of the Fabrique was a seismic event. It did not, however, cause an immediate revolution. Vesalius was viciously attacked by the Galenist establishment. His former professor in Paris, Jacobus Silvius, denounced him as a madman and an impious desecrat or of the master. The inertia of a millennium of tradition could not be overcome by a single book. However brilliant, humoral theory would continue to dominate medical thinking for another 2 centuries. Queens would continue to be purged and fumigated. But the foundation had been irrevocably cracked. Vesalius had proven that the ultimate authority was the evidence of one's own eyes. The anatomical truth, once revealed, could not be unseen. It was the first light of a new empirical dawn, a light that would, eventually, be bright enough to banish the shadows of the wandering wall. The anatomical corrections of Vesalius were a profound intellectual shockwave, but they did not topple the edifice of Galenic medicine. The Fabrique had redrawn the map of the human body with stunning accuracy, but the physicians navigating that territory continued to rely on the ancient, flawed compass of humorism, a theory that had dominated Western thought for over a millennium, that was woven into the very fabric of language, culture, and philosophy, could not be undone by anatomical fact alone. To its practitioners, humorism was more than a medical hypothesis. It was a complete, internally coherent system for understanding the human condition. Its decay would not be a sudden collapse, but a slow, piece-by-piece erosion, a war of attrition waged over centuries by a new generation of thinkers who challenged not just Galen's conclusions, but his entire way of thinking. A different kind of assault came from a bombastic and controversial contemporary of Vesalius, the Swiss physician Theophrastus von Hohenheim, who called himself Paracelsus. Where Vesalius was an empirical reformer, meticulously correcting the old texts, Paracelsus was a chemical revolutionary who sought to burn them to the ground. A feat he famously performed in a public bonfire with the works of Galen and Avicenna. He rejected the entire humoral framework of hot, cold, moist, and dry. Instead, he envisioned the human body as a microcosm of the universe, governed not by four humors but by three primary principles: salt, representing the principle of stability and substance; sulfur, the principle of inflammability and spirit; and mercury, the principle of fusibility in the soul. To Paracelsus, disease was not a humoral imbalance, but a localized chemical failure, often caused by an external agent. The cure, therefore, was not to be found in balancing opposing qualities with herbs, but in fighting poison through precisely formulated chemical remedies. This was the dawn of aeterochemistry, a new school of thought that, while steeped in alchemy and mysticism, fundamentally shifted the therapeutic focus from botany to mineralogy, from diet to dosage. More devastating still to the court tenets of Galen, was the work of the English physician William Harvey. In 1628, Harvey published a slim, 70-page book titled An Anatomical Exercise on the Motion of the Heart and Blood in Animals. Through a series of brilliant, unelegant experiments involving live animal dissection and simple mathematical calculation, Harvey demonstrated conclusively that the blood circulates through the body in a closed loop, pumped by the heart through the arteries and returning through the veins. This seemingly simple discovery was a direct and fatal blow to the physiological foundation of humorism. Galen had taught that blood was continuously produced in the liver from digested food, infused with natural spirits, and then flowed out to the body's tissues, where it was consumed as nourishment. Harvey proved this was impossible. He calculated that the amount of blood pumped by the heart in a single hour far exceeded the total weight of the man himself. The blood could not be constantly produced and consumed. It had to be the same blood, constantly torch. This single insight rendered the entire practice of bloodletting, the cornerstone of humoral therapy, physiologically incoherent. If blood was not being overproduced, then what, precisely, was the physician draining away? While Harvey remapped the body's physiological highways, the Dutch draper and amateur scientist Anthony van Leeuwenhoek was revealing that this landscape was inhabited. Using his own handcrafted, single-lens microscopes of unprecedented power, Leeuwenhoek in the 1672 became the first human to observe and describe single-celled organisms, which he called animalcules. He found them in pond water, in dental plaque, and in human semen, where he gave the first detailed description of spermatozoa. This discovery of a teeming microscopic world, invisible to the naked eye, presented a profound challenge to a medical system that had no conceptual space for it. Disease could not simply be an internal imbalance of four fluids if the body was in fact a complex ecosystem interacting with an unseen realm of living creatures. This growing body of new knowledge, from anatomy and chemistry to physiology and microscopy, slowly fostered a new approach to medicine itself, championed by figures like the English physician Thomas Sydenham. Sydenham turned away from abstract, a priori theorizing about humoral states and advocated for a return to direct, meticulous clinical observation at the bedside. He argued that diseases were specific, distinct entities like species of plants, which could be identified, classified, and described based on their unique constellation of symptoms. One did not treat choler, one treated gout or smallpox. This was the nascent beginning of modern nosology and clinical diagnostics. It was a gradual shift in the medical gaze, away from the patient's constitution and towards the specific character of their ailment. But this decay was agonizingly slow. For the queens and noble women of the 17th and even 18th centuries, the revolution was happening in lecture halls and laboratories, far from the royal bedchamber, where the old dogmas, their mortally wounded, refused to die. While the grand intellectual shifts of the Renaissance and scientific revolution slowly dismantled the theoretical foundations of humoral medicine, our knowledge of the specific, often bizarre, practices prescribed to royal and noble women is not based on speculation. It is grounded in a remarkable body of written evidence that survived the centuries, the medical texts themselves. The unvarnished records of a medical worldview, both complex and profoundly alien to our own. They are the artifacts that allow us to reconstruct, in clinical detail, the logic and the methods of the physicians who attended these queens. Among the most important of these sources is a collection of texts known as the Rotula. For much of the medieval period, the Rotula was the single most influential and widely circulated compendium on women's medicine. It was a practical manual, a handbook covering everything from menstruation and conception to childbirth and cosmetics. For centuries, it was believed to have been written by a single female physician, Trota of Salerno, a historical figure from the 11th century medical school of Salerno in southern Italy, a unique center of learning where women were known to have practiced and taught. This attribution, however, is a later simplification. Modern scholarship has revealed that the Rotula is in fact an ensemble of 3 distinct texts by different authors, compiled and bound together in the 12th century. The first, the Book on the Conditions of Women, is likely based on the practical experiences of the historical Trota. The second and longest, on treatments for women, is a more theoretical work by an unknown male author. The third, on women's cosmetics, deals with skincare, hair, and general beautification. Despite its composite nature, the Rotula was read as a single, authoritative work. Its influence was immense. It was translated from Latin into numerous vernacular languages, French, English, Dutch, Catalan, and over 130 manuscript copies survive today, a testament to its widespread use. It was the go-to reference for physicians, midwives, and educated lay people on all matters of female health, and within its pages, we find the direct textual evidence for many of the practices we have discussed. It details recipes for pes aries to soften a hard womb, lists of herbs to provoke menstruation, and prescriptions for fumigation as to correct uterine displacement. It contains diagnoses based on the humoral qualities of coldness, wetness, heat, and dryness. The Rotula is a window directly into the medieval gynecological clinic, preserving both the more sensible, experience-based remedies of the historical Trota and a more dogmatic, theory-driven prescriptions of her male successors. Beyond the Rotula, a vast library of other medical texts reinforces and expands upon this knowledge. The works of the Persian physician Avicenna, particularly his monumental canon of medicine, were translated into Latin and became a cornerstone of the medieval university curriculum. Avicenna's canon codified and systemated Galenic theory on an unprecedented scale, providing physicians with a comprehensive encyclopedia of diseases and remedies. His sections on gynecology are filled with detailed prescriptions for infertility, meticulously categorized according to the patient's supposed humoral imbalance. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern, new texts emerged, often written in the vernacular and intended for a wider audience. The German physician Eucharius Rosselin's The Rose Garden, first published in 1513, became the standard printed manual for midwives and physicians on childbirth. It was quickly translated into English as The Birth of Mankind and other languages, spreading its influence across Europe. It included significant sections on the causes and cures of barrenness, perpetuating the established humoral theories in the new medium of print. These printed books, often illustrated with woodcuts, including the anatomically incorrect bicorn weight uterus, standardized and disseminated this body of knowledge more widely than any manuscript ever could. These texts are not simply quaint relics. They are the clinical records of immense and prolonged suffering. When we read a prescription in the Rotula for fumigation using sulfur to correct a cold and wet womb, we are reading the direct justification for a procedure that inflicted real pain on a real woman. When Avicenna's canon details the signs of a slippery womb, we are seeing the diagnostic logic that led to a queen being subjected to astringent, irritating pes aries. These books provide the intellectual scaffolding for the entire ordeal. They are the cold, clinical proof that these treatments were not the random acts of ignorant quacks, but the systematic application of a deeply held, internally consistent, and institutionally sanctioned scientific paradigm. They are the written testimony of the tormentors, preserved in their own dispassionate, scholarly hand. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the eventual rise of germ theory and modern cellular biology would seem to have consigned the doctrines of humoral ism and the wandering womb to the deepest archives of medical history. The lancet, the clear glass flask, and the censer of aromatic fumes are now artifacts in a museum, symbols of a thankfully distant and unenlightened past. The fundamental patterns of thought that underpin these ancient practices have demonstrated a remarkable and unsettling resilience. They have not vanished, they have simply mutated, shedding their ancient terminology of humors and astrology and cloaking themselves in the modern, far more palatable language of wellness, balance, and natural harmony. Echoes of the medieval fertility clinic can be found, often hiding in plain sight, within the landscape of contemporary pseudoscience and alternative medicine. The core principle of humoralism, that health is a state of systemic balance, remains the foundational concept for a vast swath of modern alternative therapies. While the four humors have been discarded, they have been replaced by new, equally nebulous dualities, toxins and cleanses, acidity and alkalinity, yin and yang, or blocked and flowing energies. The modern wellness industry, much like the medieval physician, often frames the female body, particularly the reproductive system, as an environment that must be meticulously managed and balanced to achieve fertility. The language has changed, but the logic is strikingly familiar. A woman struggling with infertility might be told her body is too toxic, a modern reformation alley of the medieval diagnosis of a body cluttered with corrupt humors. The prescribed solution is not a purge of hellebore, but a detox regimen of expensive juices, restrictive diets, or colonic irrigations, a gentler, but conceptually identical, subtractive therapy designed to cleanse the vessel. The ancient prescriptions of heating and cooling foods have also found a new life. While the galenic qualities are no longer explicitly named, many alternative fertility diets categorize foods based on their perceived energetic properties. A woman might be advised to avoid cold foods or ice cream, which are believed to create a cold and unreceptive womb, and to favor warming foods like ginger tea, cinnamon, and soups. This is a direct echo of the medieval physician's prescription to counteract the queen's innate female coldness. The dietary advice is not based on nutritional science but on the same ancient, sympathetic logic that the qualities of the food are directly transferred to the body of the consumer. Even the more esoteric practices have their modern analogues. The uterine fumigation, a procedure that seems emblematic of a bygone era, has seen a resurgence in the form of vaginal steams. Promoted by wellness influencers and boutique spas, this practice involves sitting over a bowl of steaming water infused with herbs. The claims made are strikingly similar to those found in the Tia Rotula, that the warm, herbal steam can cleanse the uterus, balance hormones, and improve fertility by increasing blood flow and relaxing the pelvic floor. From a modern medical perspective, the practice is both physiologically implausible and potentially harmful, carrying risks of burns and disruption of the natural vaginal flora. Yet, its appeal lies in the same ancient logic that drove its medieval predecessor, a direct, physical intervention to purify and warm the reproductive core of the body. The psychological patterns are also disturbingly parallel. Much like the medieval queen, a modern woman grappling with infertility is often encouraged to see her body as a project to be managed and perfected. She is inundated with advice that places the burden of success or failure squarely upon her own lifestyle choices. If she fails to conceive, it is not due to a complex biological issue, but because she did not adhere strictly enough to the diet, did not buy the right supplements, did not perform the right cleansing rituals, or, most insidiously, because she was distressed and did not cultivate a sufficiently positive mindset. This creates the same cycle of guilt, self-blame, and bodily alienation. Her body becomes a source of anxiety and failure, a malfunctioning machine that she is told can only be fixed through the adoption of an ever-expanding list of often expensive and scientifically unsupported protocols. Of blaming the patient for the failure of the cure persists, repackaged for a new century. While these modern Nikos carry a certain resonance, we must draw a sharp, critical distinction between the voluntary, often commercialized, pursuit of wellness and the coercive, high-stakes reality of the historical ordeal. The medieval queen did not choose her treatments from a menu of boutique options. She was a state asset, her body subject to a non-consensual medical regimen dictated by the unassailable authority of the physician and the existential imperatives of the crown. It is in this profound lack of agency that the true legacy of her suffering resides, a suffering made all the more chilling by its near-total silence in the historical record. For every Catherine of Aragon whose plight was chronicled in the letters of ambassadors, there were countless other royal and noble women whose stories have vanished completely. They are the historical ghosts of the dynastic machine, their names attached to a marriage treaty, their presence noted in a court chronicle, and their eventual fate, repudiation, divorce, a quiet removal to a convent, recorded as a mere political footnote. Their subjective experience is a perfect and impenetrable void. We have no diaries, no letters, no accounts written in their own hand that detail the fear, the pain, the humiliation, and the despair of their clinical ordeal. Their voices are utterly absent. This silence is the direct result of the nature of the records themselves. Our knowledge of their suffering comes almost exclusively from the detached, scholarly perspective of their tormentors. The physician's casebook, the university medical text, the theological treatise on divine punishment, these are the sources. And in these documents, the woman herself is systematically erased and replaced by a clinical problem. She is not a person, she is a diagnosis. The physician does not record her cries of pain as he applies a blistering plaster. He records the quantity and quality of the serous fluid drawn forth, noting it as a successful evacuation of a corrupt humor. He does not describe her terror as she chokes down a poisonous draught of hellebore. He clinically observes the violence of the subsequent purge and pronounces it a therapeutic success. The medical language itself is an instrument of this dehumanization. Her body is a landscape, a text to be read and interpreted. Her womb is a field, a vessel, a garden. It is cold, wet, slippery, obstructed. It is an object to be acted upon, to be scoured, heated, dried, and fumigated. This clinical gaze strips her of all personhood, reducing her to a collection of malfunctioning parts, a biological puzzle to be solved. The very records that allow us to know what was done to her are a monument to a profound and chilling act of erosua, preserving the mechanics of her torment while annihilating the memory of her humanity. This legacy of suffering was not merely psychological. For the women who endured years of these treatments, the long-term physical consequences would have been devastating. The chronic ingestion of toxic herbs and heavy metals like mercury and arsenic would have resulted in irreversible organ damage, neurological disorders, and a slow, painful decline. The invasive application of caustic pests, aeries, and fumigation would have caused internal scarring, chronic infections, and permanent pain. A queen who survived her fertility treatments was likely a woman who would live out her days in a state of chronic, medically induced illness. Even in the unlikely event of success, her ordeal was not over. A successful conception was not a liberation but a progression to the next, equally perilous, stage of her duty, surviving childbirth in an era of unhygienic practices and brutal obstetric interventions. Her body was, in the end, a resource to be consumed by the state. And the price of that consumption was paid in a currency of silent, misunderstood, and unrecorded agony. And so we closed the physician's casebook on the barren queen. The powders had been put away, the astrological charts have been rolled up, and the fires in the censers have long since turned to cold ash. But to dismiss this entire saga as a mere curiosity of a superstitious and ignorant age is to miss the far more unsettling truth it reveals. The humors, the wandering womb, the eagle stones are the products of a particular time. But the forces that drove this ordeal are timeless. The true poison at work here was not the mercury in the purge or the savin in the potion. The true poison was certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of the physician in his ancient texts. The absolute certainty of the king in his divine right to an heir. The absolute certainty of the theologian in his interpretation of God's will. It was a perfect, closed system of thought, impervious to evidence, immune to compassion, and utterly devastating in its application. This narrative is a case study in the terrifying power of a flawless theory applied to a flawed and fragile human body. the desire for a simple answer to a complex and painful problem, like the chaos of an uncertain succession, is a powerful and dangerous human impulse. It creates a hunger for systems, for dogmas, for authorities who can promise a cure, a solution, a guarantee. It leads us to trust the map, even when our own eyes tell us the landscape is different. The women at the heart of this story were not just the victims of bad medicine. They were the victims of this universal human hunger for certainty. A hunger that is as alive today as it was in the 16th century. The story is done. But it leaves behind a question. Faced with the same choice, what would you have done? Sleep on that. The record is now closed.